So welcome everyone to this supervisor webinar. Uh, I appreciate it's going to be quite challenging to have introductions, given that we've got about 43, 44 participants. So what I did is I decided to create a very quick poll that will help us understand who you are and whether you've got prior experience with SENSS. I think the poll is already on your screens. What I'll do is I'll move on my slides to give you a sense of the QR code. So you could basically scan through your mobile phone if you want, and you can see the results are updating and there in front of you. I think we've got very good representation from most institutions. The If you scroll down, you will see the results updating in front of you. We've got, representation from all thematic panels. Obviously, justice, institutions, and social change, and health, well-being, and social care are the two biggest of our thematic panels in terms of institutional participation. And I'm very pleased to see that the vast majority of colleagues who attend today's seminar haven't actually supervised a SENSS funded student before in the previous iteration of the consortium. Obviously, we've got at least 9 of us having supervised students before. So there are some familiar faces and names in the audience, but it's good always to have fresh blood coming into the consortium and into the DTP. And I think that reflects also the fact that with the thematic panel approach, we gave more opportunities to people from diverse kind of disciplinary backgrounds to join us as supervisors. I'll stop the poll there. Thank you very much. That gives me a very good sense of who's attending and institutions and thematic panels. And also the last question gives me a very good sense of where I should pitch the discussion. So I'll move on with, hasn't closed that one? Is it still there? I think, could you close it? Yes. So if you close the poll, you should be able to see only the slides. Yeah, that's fine. Felicity will be monitoring the
Can't see results.
Some people can't see results. What I'll do is I'll share those results afterwards. So as we are sharing the video recording, I will be sharing the results so you get a sense of who's here today with us. Right. First of all, a very quick outline of the issues we will be covering. I've structured the presentation in kind of 3 segments, and I have very happily plagiarized a lot of the material that we use for the induction. So many thanks to the SENSS core team and Mark Johnson, our deputy director who has responsibility from training, who have put a lot of those slides together. And I'm just going to be reflecting on the things we told to the students so you know exactly where you come as supervisors. So I'll talk a bit about the key changes from the previous funding terms and conditions. There are 2 important changes that constitute a cultural shift from ESRC perspective. I'll then talk a bit about how to integrate the training offered from SENSS in the PhD, and then the role of the supervisor. So all the information I'm going to give you is to help you shape the PhD supervision and the relationship you will have with the student over the next 3.5, 4 years. Now, there are 2 main changes that have been introduced from ESRC as part of the new funding round, and both of them constitute what I would call cultural change in terms of mentality and mindset. The first one has to do with the completion date and the associated length of the studentship. So in the past, the funding date and the completion date could have been two different dates. So what usually was happening is the student would be finishing with the funding periods, and they would continue on a kind of writing up year, which they could utilize to kind of finish the PhD. The SRC has changed that, and in the new terms and conditions, they are actually asking us to have the funding date as the completion date for the students. So effectively, the student will receive, a minimum of 3.5 years of funding, and at the end of those 3.5 years, they will also have to submit their PhD. Now, I appreciate that this is quite challenging. I appreciate that sometimes it goes against university regulations because universities still allow the fourth year. I can reassure you that it's something that myself and all other directors have a very strong agreement on, and we keep pushing the SRC back in terms of going back to the previous regime, which allowed us to have additional writing up time. Now, at the moment, the policy is very clear and it's very strict, and I'd like you to try and supervise the students with that policy in mind. And if, of course, we have positive outcomes from the discussions of the directors with the SRC, I will come back with an update on that one. But so far, the request from the SRC is that the completion date and the funding end date for the student, they should be on the same day. Now, someone could ask me here, and what does it mean if the student misses that? It means that the student is then treated as a non-completion for the university. And if that proportion of non-completions falls below, I think it's 70%, if it falls below 70%, the university, the SRC might exercise the right to stop that university from getting additional funding with regards to PhDs for the next 1 or 2 years. So effectively what happens is you could have what we would call a black spot on the university's record, and that university will be stopped from recruiting ESRC funded students. Felicity, was there's anything to add there? No, that's fine. So that's kind of the penalty that the SRC is going to impose if the proportion of completions falls below that 70%. And what they will be seeing now is they will be seeing one date in the system, which is going to be the completion date and the funding end date. The second cultural change and cultural shift was that the SRC is now asking us to provide every funded student the opportunity to do an integrated placement. We've taken the decision at SENSS to have it as a compulsory, which means that we do give the student the funding for that placement in the beginning. And I'll come back to placements later on, and we will be supporting all students towards securing placements throughout their studies. The rationale that the SRC utilized to actually integrate or bring that placement into the PhD was that in the past, we were seeing a lot of students completing their PhD without actually developing crucial skills for engagement and impact with external organizations. And they wanted to give the opportunity to students to actually develop those skills as part of their PhD. And therefore, now, all the funding we receive has additional time for that placement to take place, as I said, within the 3.5 years. Again, this is another challenge that all of us have to navigate, in the sense that not only we're asking the student to produce a PhD within the 3.5 years, but we're also asking them to undertake a placement for 3 months. And as I said, these 3 months are actually included in the 3.5 years. And therefore, the student will have to spend considerable amount of time in a partner, in an external organization, navigating through the difficulties of embedding themselves into that organization and then developing the skills. So, in a sense, the message I'd like to send out, and I know it's a difficult message to convey. The message is that the ESRC is asking more on behalf of the student and the supervisor from what it was asking before. Obviously, they're giving us slightly more funding to do that, but I don't feel that that amount of additional funding we receive, which is usually 6 months, is kind of appropriate to cover all these challenges. And as I said, that's a continuous discussion that we have with the SRC in terms of the nature of the PhD. But on the other hand, I do see this second kind of change as an important change to the better, because it allows us to help students and support them in developing skills for diverse careers and not only academic careers. So talking a bit about the length of the studentship, most of you might have received different kind of lengths of studentships. Just to give you a bit of background of how that is decided. So unless the student has already started their PhD, the standard that we would go for a student with an existing master's is going to be 3.5 years. That actually includes the 3 years, which is the standard time for the PhD, 3 months for any additional training that the student might have to do, and 3 months for the placement. And the maximum we would get in terms of the competitions would be the 4.5 years, which is usually the standard we will use for someone without a full master's or a full master's level training before proceeding to the MPhil or the PhD. There are obviously other award lengths in between the 3.5 and the 4.5 years, and some students have received these different award lengths. And the process we decided to follow was that, we asked the supervisors, so yourselves, to give us additional information, look at the students' skills and their additional training needs. Those were then looked by the thematic panels, and at the end, they were looked by myself. And occasionally, we have given students additional time because, for example, the project might require significant additional training that the students would take more than 3 months, which is the standard we would expect to complete. So at the outset, that amount of funding the student has received includes the 3 months for the research in practice placement. I'll come back, as I said, to the placement, but if the student doesn't undertake a placement, we will have to reduce that funding accordingly. The student must submit their thesis within the funded period of the studentship, and the additional time where the student might get extensions is for any successful overseas institutional visits, and I'll come back to the overseas institutional visits at the end of the presentation. There are other circumstances like parental and sick leave, where, in those cases, the funded period would be extended beyond what we have actually said in the award letter. But these are all the only other conditions where we would be giving extensions, at least, and I'm touching wood, in normal circumstances, because we've learned from the last 5 years, basically 4 years, that things can change quite a lot, and the future is something that we cannot predict. Now, the second, so that's around the funding period and the submission, which is the major cultural change that I would say. The second is around placements, and placements are a key component for the PhD. As I said, the ESRC and ourselves, we have introduced this element of placements in order to be able to give students the opportunity to develop skills that are not necessarily developed in an academic environment. And the placements can be designed flexibly to meet the needs of the project, as well as the students' individual training. And I've got there some examples of the additional skills a student can develop through the placement, additional research networks, experience with a non-academic environment, potentially get feedback on their research findings, especially if they work for organizations that have an interest. This is particularly relevant for those of you that are here from collaborative partners and, collaborative supervising collaborative projects, but also, learn new skills. So the end aim for the PhD is to enable the student to develop a diversity of skills that could help them kind of pursue careers in diverse jobs and diverse roles. So not only kind of constrain them in the academic world, but being able to work in other research capacity roles in organizations. Um, there are several types of placements that we could consider. First of all, you as supervisors, either collaborative or regular supervisors, you might have an existing relationship with a partner, and you might want to get the student integrated within that partner and share some of the research findings. We've got the UKRI and the SRC, which they advertise several placements on an annual basis. As a doctoral training partnership, we have been in the past very successful in securing placements, especially in the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology and other UKRI. We will also, as part of the bid development, uh, with our external partners, we have secured a number of placements. A lot of them are with local government organizations, civil society organizations, third sector. Some of them are with our academic partners as well. And what will happen is, as we're progressing, those placements will be advertised on the virtual learning environment. And of course, the core team, Mark and Jenny, are at the moment very busy in developing and organizing workshops for students, helping them and supporting them on identifying a suitable placement and planning for that applications. And we will make those workshops obligatory for students. So I'm quite certain that we won't have a situation where the student will be left with no placement at the end of the day, and we will make sure that there is also a very good match between the student and the placement. All right. I'll read the question because the chat might not be visible for everyone. Is there any advice on whether a student can do their placements with an organization they may also be working with to recruit study participants? I think the answer is yes, because that would be part of their PhD and part of the research. As supervisors, the advice I'd give is your work with that student to help them develop skills. And we would look to you to basically ensure that the skills the student is actually developing are appropriate for future careers. So I think that is a case where, the organization is recruiting study participants. The student can be integrated in that organization. They can have a placement. And when I mentioned earlier that the placement can take kind of place in a flexible format, although the total amount of time is 3 months, it doesn't have to be spent as 3 months, within one go. You could have, and I know I've had several discussions, for example, with collaborative project supervisors, where we could have the placement being, split in different parts because the student might be developing different skills. So it's very different to talk about accessing data and working with a collaborative organization to access the data, and then of course disseminating research findings, which might actually take place at the later stages of the PhD. So as long as we have a good record of the time the student is spending with the external organization, and that then all amounts up to 3 months, it's absolutely fine to think about flexible ways of utilizing the placement time with the student. Uh, So no, the placement is 3 months, is not 6 months, unless the student is doing the PhD uh, on a part-time basis, which means that then the placement would be for 6 months, which is the equivalent of 3 months. But the funding the student gets and the extension the time they would get is the equivalent of 3 months, so 0.25. So, as I said, the 3 month placement has already been factored into the studentship award and structure, and this is why we have a 3.5 years as our starting. Um, the placement During the placement, the student will continue to receive the stipend. So we wouldn't expect the external organization to provide them with a salary. It's the stipend that eats the salary at that point. And ideally, the host will contribute um, towards the cost of the placement if there is, travel expenses and things like that. But again, in our policy, we've got about £1,000 that can be awarded towards reasonable costs for that placement. And in other cases where we need to have additional funds, we can work with the students to flexibly utilize what we call the research training support grant funds, which is specific, to the students, and utilize those funds to kind of support them throughout the placement. Um, the general kind of ESRC guidance is that placement shouldn't take place very early in the thesis or too late in the thesis, because effectively those are crucial periods for the student to integrate themselves into their studies or kind of complete the studies at the end. So effectively, we don't expect the students to take a placement in their master's year. They can apply for that placement, but that needs to take place within their PhD. And also, we wouldn't allow students to take their placement into the last 3 months before the funding end date, because we're getting very close to the completion date at that point, and the student might have to do other things around their PhD. And that's a general rule of thumb for any kind of additional activity. So, for example, when I come back to overseas institutional visits, these rules around when these things can take place are exactly the same. So when you think about the placement and how that placement gets integrated in the thesis, you probably need to be thinking, the second part of the first year till the first part of their third year is the ideal period for the student to undertake the placement. As I said, we hope we don't end up in a situation like this one, but it is within our policy. If there are any difficulties, and despite the best efforts from the student, the supervisor, the SENSS core team, the student can't identify a placement, the in that case, we will have to be reducing the length of the award by the 3 months, and this is why we're actually not allowing the student to undertake the placement in the last 6 months. And if, for example, they hold the 3.5 studentship, the funding award will be reduced to 3 years and 3 months, and they will be required then to submit their thesis at the end of that reduced period. So that's quite crucial to consider. But I believe that we have enough opportunities out there for the students, and there are quite significant number of also projects that have a collaborative element that we will be able to provide funding for each and every placement for each and every student in our cohorts. Were there any other questions, Felicity, so far?
Rachel Comenta was asking if it's compulsory, if it's factored into the funding structure. No,
Yes, so yes, it is. It is within the structure. So,
question from Kevin Daniels.
We have planned 3 months development at the start of year 4 after submission, and then from months 4 to 6 in year 4 completion of the placement. This is okay.
Sounds like it's outside the funding period.
Kevin, the placement needs to be within the funding period, not outside the funding period. The way you phrase the question indicates to me that it's outside the funding period.
If I can come in, so
Yes.
we thought there was 3.5 years funding. So years 1 to 3 we have the research, and then the student will submit, all being well, and then in our proposal we had at the start of year 4, so that's into so basically in the last 6 months, 1 to 3 months will be development activities for the placement, and then basically from months 34 to, it's not 36, is it? So for the second half of the first half of the 4th year, if you like, so up to the last 3 months of the 3.5 years, then the placement will be taking place. That's what we put in our proposal. So I'm not quite sure if that's still okay.
Once the student submits their thesis, that is the end of the funding award. So if they submit early, their award will end on the date on which they submit. Unless, I mean, there is an exception to that, but it's a very slight exception, and says if they can continue to be funded to the end of that term if they're doing research which links directly to their PhD. But it would have to, the placement will have to be before submission.
So I think there is, I think the confusion is there with the use of the year 4.
Yeah.
So Kevin, if I got it correctly, the student does the PhD research from year 1, year 2, year 3, completes that PhD research, and therefore they've got the 0.5 still for the funding. The student doesn't submit the PhD, but they do the integrated placements at the first 3 months of that 4th year, and then they've got another 3 months at the end of that period. Am I correct in interpreting what you've said?
No, not quite. So what we put in the proposal is years 1 to 3 is the research. Then what we have then is sort of so you're now into the 4th year. So the first 3 months of the 4th year, which will be October, November, December, that's on doing development activities with some of this will be with the collaborative partner on basically developing skills for what we want the placement to do. And then the placement will be in the last 3 months of the 3.5 years.
Okay, let's take that discussion offline. There will be a way around it in a way that we don't breach ESRC rules. It doesn't sound completely unreasonable in terms of what, but what we might want to do is have the development activities and the placement in an integrated way over those last 6 months. That it's not development only activities and placement only activities. It is a collaborative partnership anyway, so the collaborative partner will be guaranteeing that the placement is taking place. So from that perspective, I don't think that would be an issue. But perhaps we can have an offline discussion around the details.
I mean, it sounds. I mean, we could accommodate that, but basically, you're also saying that because this ESRC is saying, oh, you have to submit within 3 years, and then it's 3.5 years.
The ESRC is saying that the student has to submit within 3.5 years.
3.5 years, right? Okay, so that's slightly different from the other ones. Okay, that's fine. I think I'm okay.
Okay, good.
Rachel's asked a question which I've responded to. But you can tell
Yeah. So Rachel also has asked a question, which is it possible for the placements to be overseas? Is an overseas institutional visit different to the placements as we're currently discussing? So a placement can be overseas, as Felicity raises in the response. It could be that there are additional costs there, which is something to consider. But yes, the placement can be overseas. Rachel, I remember it's one of the collaborative projects, this one with the Brazilian partner, if I'm not mistaken. So the answer is yes there. The overseas institutional visit is something completely different from the placement. The student there are students that will do a placement and an institutional visit, and I'll come back to what the institutional visit has more of an academic kind of background or element. embedded into it. I'll come back when we talk about overseas institutional visits in the next couple of slides. So the next part is around integrating the training that we offer. So here, what I'd like to do is give you a sense of the landscape of the training that SENSS offer. So for you and the student, you can start thinking about how utilizing that training to develop certain skills. And I'll start by kind of saying that all our students on an annual basis will be doing a development needs analysis. Some of those have already started doing it. Some of those students, might have already approached you to discuss their development needs analysis. All the training we offer builds on the ESRC training guidelines and expectations. Those were refreshed in 2022, and we try to map the training activities we do on those training guidelines. And what we do is, we use information in the annual development needs analysis, information provided in the application to develop an offering for our students that would cater for the diverse needs. And then, of course, if there are more individual needs, the student can tap into what we call the research training support grant, which I'll discuss in the next few minutes as well. So that's more of an individual kind of funding area where the student can utilize to develop skills. In all our tools for the students, we utilize a framework developed by Vitae. I expect most supervisors to be kind of knowledgeable of this framework. It's the research and development framework, 4 domains: knowledge, personal effectiveness, governance, and engagement and impact. The questions on the development needs analysis are framed around this framework. We get students to think about their development needs on the basis of that framework and how that framework can help them become kind of a researcher. So the development needs analysis, it has already been launched for this year. As I said, if the students haven't approached you already to discuss their development needs analysis, please, in the next meeting you have with them, remind them the deadline for the completion is on the 6th of December. Completing the development needs analysis requires a meeting with the supervisor to discuss the responses, and it has effectively 2 parts. One, it's a very quantitative part which assess the skills, ask them to self-reflect and assess those skills. The other one is a qualitative part which kind of asks them at this stage to reflect on their training needs. And as students progress in the next year, we will also ask them to reflect on the plans they had, the year before. It is an ESRC requirement. So we are required from the ESRC to report back on the completion rate. So far with SENSS DTP1, we had always 100% completion rate. It's a very good way also for you and your students to record and structure planning. For me, it's one of those opportunities where I said, look, this is the discussion we had. It's a full meeting around training and development. And on an annual basis, at least you have that meeting, which is not only you checking the progress of the PhD, but you check the progress on the students' development in terms of skills. And then, of course, the kind of input of that form from yourselves and the students allow us to kind of develop our own training offering for the students. So it informs SENSS training development. So it's actually quite an important part of work that we do at SENSS for our students. Now, what does the landscape look like in terms of training? Obviously, your students have access to the core and specialist training offered by doctoral colleges and graduate schools across institutions. Mark, Jenny, and the development and mobility training group are currently working on a project which will help us map the different training offerings across institutions and create a list of that training offering. So if students have needs, they can find out from that kind of register where they can go and address that need. The students have already access to the virtual learning environment. you as supervisors, you will get access in the next few days. We are doing almost like a staged kind of launch of the VLE. We will automatically register you on the VLE, so you won't have to do anything. You will get an email, and that gives them access to SAGE Campus. We have the partnership with UEA on the annual online training series, which is going to be available from January and covers a variety of different aspects of research methods. We've got the annual conference this year. The annual conference is taking place at Cranfield University, 9th and 10th of July. Social Sciences Beyond Academia will be the theme. I know some of you have contributed in the past as guest speakers, panelists. We always extend an invitation to supervisors to attend our annual conference, should you wish to do so. And then, of course, we will have other periodic SENSS half-day workshops. We're currently working on a workshop on administrative data, data skills, as well as research in practice in association with Cambridge DTP. We will be able to launch in the next few weeks the specialist training that we've got additional funding from the ESRC. You will see there that there is quite a variety of modules that we will be offering, like machine learning, computational simulations, experimental survey design, analyzing textual big data from various institutions. And of course, in the next few weeks, you will also receive an invitation to apply for additional SENSS funding should you want to develop training yourselves, or should you want to fund something that is already in progress. So we're currently working on the form, and that form will go out and disseminated across the institutions. And we don't have a fortune to spend, I'm afraid. We've got some limited funding, but we would like to utilize that funding to give opportunities to colleagues to develop additional training opportunities for students, but also supervisors. So supervisors will get access as well to all that training we will be offering. And then, of course, there are additional training provisions like the UK Data Service, the UOL School of Advanced Studies, which is free, and the National Center for Research Methods, which sometimes it's free, other times it's paid for, but it can be funded by the Research Training Support Grant should the student has identified a clear need. I'll pause here. We don't have any questions on training. So I'll move on to the last part of the presentation, which is I've talked about the cultural shift, then the completion and funding end dates, the integration of the placements, the way we look at identifying development needs for our students, and your role there as a supervisor to go through those development needs as part of the development needs analysis on an annual basis with the students. I'll talk about the role of the supervisory team here, and I intentionally use the term supervisory team because we expect the supervisors to work as a team together if there is also a collaborative partner with a collaborative partner and support the students. So I'll provide some basic information on the studentship and the do's and don'ts, as I call them, or we call them. And then there is a very interesting table with examples that I will be using to highlight where we would expect the supervisor to play a role in more of the administrative parts of the SENSS studentship. Now, just to give you some additional information on what does the studentship include and what the students are getting as part of their studentship. So they're getting 30.7 hours paid research time per week for 48 weeks. That's the equivalent of just over £20,000 per annum from the SRC. London institutions get a London allowance as well. They get paid annual leave each year between 30 days and 8 weeks. And as far as I understand, the ESRC now requires us to almost formally record that annual leave.
They haven't quite gone to that extent yet, but they do want us to make sure that our students are taking that leave.
Okay. The paid sickness absence, of course, there is a medical certificate required, the paid parental leave, and then, as I said, opportunities to apply for additional funding like the research training support costs, language training extension, only if that has been identified in the application for difficult language, UK and overseas fieldwork, again, if that has been identified in the application, OIVs, overseas institutional visits. The amount, the training opportunities or the development of training opportunities is also going to be open to students. So students can apply for additional funding. So for example, over the last couple of years, the student committee that we have for SENSS, which from this year will also have membership from DTP2 students, has applied and they have received, funding to do a very interesting writing retreat. And then, of course, the studentship does include the placement and the placement costs there. So we would expect our full-time students to commit their full time on the PhD. So it's not permitted to hold a full-time job and a permanent part-time job. Equally, part-time students are cannot hold the full-time job, and the proportion needs to be managed appropriately to make sure that the student doesn't actually work overtime. In terms of the additional time, they are allowed a certain amount of paid teaching or other research work. So they could do a bit of additional teaching, they could do a bit of additional research projects, and they can top up income through that. But at every single time, they need to respect the 37.5 hours a week rule. And there are exceptional opportunities, and we have had this case in the past. So I'd like to bring this one to your attention, that they can suspend their studentship for up to 12 months if there is a paid job, as long as this work is linked to and benefits their PhD. So we had in the past someone that was, they did a placement with a law firm. They were subsequently offered, a kind of a job. They took an intermission of 12 months. They embedded themselves into that role, and then they returned back, if I remember correctly, on a part-time basis. So they were working for the law firm on a part-time basis, completing their PhD on a part-time basis. So that is kind of, in essence, a way of supporting students if an important opportunity arises throughout their PhD, not to miss that opportunity, but at the same time not withdraw from their studies. The stipend is tax-free. Any other work they will do will get taxed. Now, it is also important here to highlight that as SENSS, we are effectively responsible for the funding elements of the PhD. We're not an award power holding institution. We're not awarding the PhD. So in reality, when it comes to the administration of the studies, the home institution is the one that is responsible. When it comes to arranging supervisory changes, we would like to be involved in that, but it's the home's university responsibility to ensure that the student receives appropriate supervision. And the home institution is also responsible for providing them the basic infrastructure for studies, like a library, a computer, or anything like that. What we make sure from our side is that the funding flows appropriately and the student gets their funding when they're supposed to be getting that funding. So sometimes, in some cases, there is not a clear divide. So if there is any uncertainty, the first point of contact for the students as well as the supervisors is the operational lead at each institution. And one of the things I always say here is that it's better for us to know as early as possible if there are challenging circumstances in a studentship, because we can then support not only the home institution, but you as supervisors in addressing them and tell you what is permissible and what's not permissible according to the SNC rules, find ways of helping you navigate those sometimes complex rules. So it's really, really important if there is a challenging situation emerging where the student might, face, let's say, family issues, or they might be facing health issues, or they might suddenly develop a disability. It's good for us to know as early as possible so we can support you in your role as a supervisor, and we can also support the student accordingly. Now, I promise I give a few examples. And Felicity, is it you that put this table together?
Yes.
So particularly thanks to Felicity for uh, putting this table together, but it gives you a very good, it spans over a couple of pages, but it gives you a very good idea of, where the supervisor role sits within the different processes, and, what we expect from the supervisor and the home institution and the students, and what's our involvement in the process. So, for example, if it's a case where the student needs to apply for disability student allowance, and the student is the owner of that process, they are the ones that need to kind of provide the different reports. You simply are aware of that, and then the home institution and ourselves take forward that claim. Um, Now, when it comes to the research training support grant, and I'll come back to the RTSG in a minute once I finish with this table and explain a bit more about the process, the student again applies for the funding, but we would expect you to provide the supporting statement. And then the role of the home institution is simply to become aware, because in reality, we are in control of that funding, and we will be transferring that funding to the student and the home institution. So there are several areas where we would expect the supervisor to provide supporting statements. And the reason we do that is A, because we want you to be aware that the student has applied for this. So they have applied for overseas fieldwork, they have applied for an overseas institutional visit, they have applied for a placement or substantial changes to the PhD. But we would also like you to uh, take that change into consideration in terms of the planning of the PhD. So, for example, if there is a switch from part-time to full-time and vice versa, that constitutes quite a big change in the way you will be working with that student over the next few years. So we would expect you to kind of not only be aware of that, but we would expect you to be in support of that, because it might not necessarily fit with your working pattern. So there are things there that we need to know, and you need to know from that application. So in a lot of the cases, we would expect the supervisor to provide a supporting statement, and there are several other examples there where we simply expect you to become aware. So, for example, the annual leave, we would expect the student to tell you that they're going on their planned annual leave. We don't expect any supporting statements or anything like that, but we would expect you to be aware of that. If the student goes on sickness absence, again, the student should tell you that they are on a sickness absence. The university is the one that will approve that, and we will simply update our record. The same with parental leave or compassionate leave. And where we will require a supporting statement is where there are intermissions and interruptions and suspensions, because we would like to have a clear plan as to what happens with that studentship in the future. And you will see there in the last kind of column of that, it's one of the few cases where actually, if the intermission is likely to need to be longer than 12 months, we would need ESRC's prior approval. And we appreciate that within the period of 3.5 years, challenges can emerge from for the student's life. And in the past we have been very supportive, but if we expect that it could go beyond the normal regulations, it's good. This is why I said it's good for us to know as early as possible so we can support you and the student. Felicity, is there anything else we need to highlight in this table? It covers most of the activities as far as I remember.
It does. I think what you need to be aware of is some of the limits to some of these things. So, for example, with compassionate leave, we allow 10 days maximum for that per event. So if a student has, say, two parents that die, during their studentship, they could take 2 sets of compassionate leave. For sickness absence, students are entitled to 13 weeks absence in a 12-month rolling period. If it goes beyond that, they will have to take unfunded leave, so intermit, suspend, or interrupt their studies. So please just be aware of those limits. There are no such limits to parental leave. So if your student decides to have 5 children or has 5 children during their studentship, that's fine. Those will be funded. And it doesn't make any impact on the length of their studies, other than that they'll get funding extensions to that as well.
Thank you. Right. In order to support you in managing the studentship, we will create a box folder for each of the students, and students yourselves as supervisory teams and the operational leads in the home institution and us will be able to access. We will be inputting there the original studentship application, the offer letter. We've sent them a copy of the annual DNA, so the student has access to those, and then copies of any other funding application the student has done in terms of RTSG or IV, overseas field work, a difficult language training, or placement. So it gives you kind of all the paperwork around the studentship, the students' development, their needs, and everything like that. And it's going to be a one-stop shop for getting additional information on the studentship. Now, I have mentioned quite a few times this term, which is Research Training Support Grant, and I'm hoping by now people and colleagues that have supervised students before, they know what it is. But for colleagues that are supervising students for the first time, just to let you know, this is a pot of money that it's supposed to support students completing the research project. It is available to everyone, including master students. It's not a personal allowance in the sense that it's ring-fenced for each student, but the students can apply for up to £1,000 per annum and up to a maximum of £3,000 over the lifetime of the funded award, which could cover a variety of things. Any additional training. So, for example, you've identified with the students a training that is being offered by the National Center for Research Methods. That training has a fee, and the student needs to spend money to travel because it's a face-to-face event. The student can tap into the RTSG to do that. The student has submitted a paper for a conference. The paper got accepted. The student wants to pay the registration fee and they want to attend the conference, and therefore they need to pay for their travel expenses and their accommodation. That's the use for the RTSG. The students can get an annual rail card as part of that. They could pay for language training costs. They could pay for UK fieldwork if they want, in terms of travel expenses. There is a variety of things the student could do. Two important things to highlight here. First of all, the students must complete their annual DNA to apply for this funding. So what we always do is we cross-check whether the student has completed their annual DNA before we release any money, and we would expect them. The rationale is that we would like to have a link between these type of activities and activities that have been identified as part of the development needs analysis. And also, there is a slight change. Well, there is a major change in the way the RTSG is being managed in DTP2 in contrast to DTP1. So in DTP2, the application for the RTSG comes straight to SENSS, and I think, let me see, comes straight to SENSS, and they tell us what they plan to spend the money on. I think, at best 2 weeks before they need to spend it, so we have time. We will ask you to support that application, and then that application goes to training and development manager for approval, and usually we will be responding back within 5 days. So the money now is being held at SENSS, and the money will be released at the home institution once that approval is there. So the student shouldn't be spending any RTSG money before they actually get the formal approval from SENSS.
Can I just butt in? There is an exception to that rule. And that is where the student is required to do some training, or the training is essential to the PhD, and they're in the process of completing the DNA, then they may put an application in, and we will consider that.
Yeah, so it's usually sometimes the period between October and December when we launch the DNA, where there is uncertainty as to whether the student has completed their DNA. So we will be demonstrating flexibility in that period. But once the deadline for submitting the DNA has passed, we will always cross-check. And just to remind you, if the student haven't approached you yet with their DNA, their development needs analysis, please remind them the deadline is on the 6th of December. And now there are things that the RTSG does not cover, and these are things like laptop. So I'm afraid ESRC doesn't allow us to buy laptops for our students. If exceptionally students are given permission to purchase equipment, and that is over £200, this needs to be returned to SENSS at the end of their studentship. Any other standard equipment that the home university should provide, any stationery, books and journals available through their home library, these are things that the RTSG does not cover. And in any case, if there is uncertainty about whether a cost is eligible or not, you could always contact the core team, and we will be responding and saying, yes, that's absolutely fine. You could put an application forward. The student can put an application forward. Last thing before we conclude and open it up for any additional questions, and I know Felicity is frantically responding to questions through the chat, is this overseas institutional visit. So every single student could apply to do an overseas institutional visit. I'll give you an example there. You have an established collaboration with, a fantastic network in an overseas institution, let's say in the Netherlands. You have been working closely with, a colleague there, and you feel that, the student should spend some time in that institution because they can tap into training activities. They can perhaps develop additional networks. They could work with that collaborator on publishing a paper together. It could be a door for future work opportunities. So the fund there is to support this type of activities. And it is a working visit. It can be up to 3 months. It doesn't have to be 3 months. It could be a month, couple of weeks. It could be up to 3 months. And that can be either a higher education institution or an organization with a substantive research office. Now, in the past, for example, we have funded overseas institutional visits in the European Central Bank, or overseas institutional visits in OECD. So these are non-higher education students, non-universities that have, though, a significant research office. Now, this has to be outside the UK. And as I said, awards are typically done for visits at universities, but we have explored opportunities with other research organizations in the past. So the plan there is that the student establish a research network, develop their skills and contacts. They could be disseminating. So, for example, that overseas institutional visit might be the opportunity for them to deliver a research seminar in that institution. They can then participate in seminars and other activities, but also sometimes undertake specialist research training. And therefore, you could have an overseas institutional visit early in the PhD or late in the PhD. Again, it's something that you need to discuss and think about with your students, where it fits in terms of the overall plan of their PhD. They come with an extension. So they're getting a funded extension of up to 3 months, plus a maximum of £4,000 towards reasonable travel and subsistence costs. One of the things that we say there is, and it's good to plan ahead in terms of those costs. So, if someone comes to me and says, look, I want to have an overseas institutional visit next week in the States, the flights on their own could be, £4,000. So, because there is a budgetary limit there, and we want to make overseas institutional visits available to as many students as possible. So, imagine here we've got a ring-fenced fund. The more we spend on one visit, the less we can spend on others. So it is unfair in a way for some students to kind of tap into more funds than they should be. So what we always say is plan well in advance for those visits, and submit your application. It could be separate visits to the same host during the course of the studentship. There is one application to be done for these 3 separate visits. In that application, the student, and in your supporting statement, you should clearly explain what's the rationale for that. Obviously, a case like that might be a bit more expensive, so that needs to be taken into consideration. And we usually kind of support students in terms of flights, visa, accommodation, and are expected to apply for other sources of funding as well, not just SENSS. One of the things there is occasionally students are asking us in their overseas visit to cover the cost of their home accommodation here, which is something that we can't cover. I'm afraid we can only cover the cost of the accommodation there, but imagine that the student also still receives the stipend as part of the institutional visit.
Question from Rachel.
Rachel, can collaborative SENSS students who have a collaborative partner abroad also still apply for an IV? The answer is yes. It might be, depending on the nature of that collaborative partner, it might be the case that they might not be hosted by that collaborative partner for the OIV, but if the collaborative partner, for example, has relationships with a higher education institution in that region, they could ask that higher education institution to host a student. And so the answer is yes. And can the OIV be the same institution as the collaborative partner? I think I've responded to that even before reading it. So the answer is, if the collaborative partner is not a higher education institution, if it does fit that profile where it has a significant research strength and length, we could explore that. But I think that's a conversation we could take offline. In principle, we wouldn't expect a student to do an overseas institutional visit in the collaborative partner because they will have done the placement in that collaborative partner. Again, a rule of thumb, not early, which means that we can't allow OIVs to take place in the master's year, and not late, so they must complete that OIV at least 3 months before the funding end date. So that's quite important to consider. And as I said, they can have multiple visits as the OIV, but they need to make one application. So they can't do one application for first visit and then the next year have a second application for another visit. If they want to do 3 visits, they need to plan that in advance and tell us in their application. So another very useful tool for you to keep in your mind in terms of helping the student and supporting the student in developing skills, but also potentially opening up doors for future job opportunities. We will have a call twice a year. Usually that's in February and September. They will be completing the application form. We will ask you to provide supporting statement. The OIV host will also have to provide a supporting statement. And if it gets approved, the student has again to comply with the home institution risk assessment policies and procedures with respect to the overseas visits, because some of those overseas visits might not be in places, and also foreign and Commonwealth Office advice in terms of travel and permission to travel in particular areas. Now, I appreciate that was quite a lot of information, especially for some of you that you've got the first studentship and you're supervising for the first time a SENSS student. I've got a slide here with our contact details. Myself and Felicity, we tend to deal with studentship management in complex cases. We should be the first point of contact. And as I said, my message there is the earlier you tell us, the better it is, because we can then support you. Felicity has huge experience with ESRC rules, regulations. She knows, all that information inside out. She can work innovative ways of finding solutions. So my message is take advantage of that. Don't let the situation escalate, because the more the situation escalates, the more difficult it is for us to address that. If there are any general queries around applications, forms, the VLE, uh, Aaron and Rach, our administrator and coordinator, are there. Some of you might have come across Rach in the competitions. That's her main role. And Aaron is the person that's behind all the fantastic work on the VLE, which we hope to be able to share with you in the next few days. And then anything related to training, development, Mark and Jenny. Mark, our deputy director. Again, Mark, a very experienced colleague with regards to SENSS. Mark also has the advantage of having the institutional perspective, because he's the dean at Goldsmiths. So, very, very experienced. And Jenny, our training and development manager, around funding applications, DNA, or training, additional training opportunities. I'll stop here. And then I know Felicity has responded to most of the questions, but if there are any other questions, I think in order to facilitate potential discussion, I'll also stop sharing my screen, because that will help us, see whether colleagues have their hands raised.
Can I make a few quick points?
Yes, and Felicity would like to make a few points. Shall I mute my microphone and you can open your microphone,
Well,
Felicity?
work. Thanks everybody for attending. It makes our lives so much better if you understand the fundamentals of managing an ESRC funded studentship. I'd like to make a couple of quick points. And we emphasized this to our students at the winter induction earlier this year. One is they should not spend any money before they have received approval for spending that money. If they do that, they will not be reimbursed those funds, and they need to provide the receipts for all of their spends, because we are audited. In fact, we have a meeting with UCRE later today as part of a massive audit exercise. I'd like to reiterate what Fragkiskos said, and that is to talk to us as soon as problems arise rather than leaving them. There are all sorts of things that we have in our toolbox to try and support students. We can't work miracles, but there are a lot of grey areas within the ESRC rules in which we can operate to support students. It's really key also that you know who the operational lead is for your university, because often they will be your first port of call, especially when it comes to understanding the interaction between your university regulations and making sure that your students are also adhering to SENSS and ESRC regulations. So I think those are the 3 points that I wanted to make, which would be really useful from our point, from an operational point of view. The operational lead at Roehampton, Lauren, is Miles Purcell. Does anyone else not know who the operational lead is? I'm more than happy to let you know. Otherwise, I'll hand back to UEA. It is Vanessa Tarling.
I believe we've got all that information on the website.
It is on the website,
It is
yeah.
on the website.
And I think earlier on, I noted that we'd be circulating a document based on these sites, but it's sort of a one-pager around what you need to do in certain circumstances and who you need to contact. And we can include the operational leads details on that as well.
Right, I'm happy to open it up for any other questions. As I said, the recording will also be available, and we will share that with you in terms of the information, the slides. As I said, we try to distill quite a lot of information in an hour and a quarter, an hour 20 minutes, and I appreciate that has been a lot of information to share. I think I try to make it as digestible as possible for you as supervisors. And we look at you as a crucial part of the PhD, because you are together with the student responsible for their training and development. And this is why, we ask the students to come to you for all these additional activities. We ask them to share with you the DNA elements, the DNA results, the DNA reflections. We ask them to come to you to get support for their overseas visits, to get support for their RTSG, everything like that. Equally, from your perspective, I hope now you've got enough tools that you can utilize to shape the studentship in a way that fits with, the vision you have for the students. Sometimes, students look towards us as supervisors, and I had it with a few of my students and saying, I'm looking at the nitty gritty details of the project, but, the supervisor has always that overarching perspective, the bird's eye view of the project in the 3 years, 3.5 years, and also the training of the student and what the student needs to do in order to hit certain milestones. And, the student will be looking towards you as supervisors to get that advice and that kind of that information. So it's useful for you to return back to those tools that we've shared with you and say, okay, these tools can help me shape that studentship that way, shape that studentship this way, give my student these additional skills and these additional tools so they can complete on time and they can have, a good CV for securing a job afterwards. I'm happy to take questions from colleagues if they want to come on mic.
There are some questions for Fragkiskos. So
I can see my chat now. Rachel is asking, can you clarify for those of us with collaborative partner students, must they visit collaborative partner as the proposal, complete a compulsory placement and optionally conduct an OIV? So for those of you that you have a collaborative partner identified and it's one of those, the expectation is that the student will do the compulsory placement with the collaborative partner. So that is something that the student, would expect to do. And I think it was also part of the evaluation of applications. They will be visiting the collaborative partner. So we would expect that placement to take place face-to-face, in essence. And if they would like to do an overseas institutional visits, again, they can apply to do that overseas institutional visits. The overseas institutional visit is an optional. And to be honest, and very frank, if all 41 students of this cohort ask for an overseas institutional visit, the money is not there. We don't have those funds. And this is why it is a competition. So what usually happens, the students submit their application and Mark, Jenny, together with the developing and training mobility group, they will assessing and evaluating the OIV applications, and they will be awarding those that, add the highest value to the students and those that demonstrate a very clear need between the students' training and what the overseas institutional partner can offer. RTSG is not routinely spent in the master's year, so they could start the language training early. I think that's part of the difficult language training application, isn't it?
Yeah, ordinarily, if students have to learn a language in order to undertake their PhD, so if they want to learn a language for fun, that isn't covered. If they need to learn a language to deliver their PhD, they're expected to start doing that alongside their masters. It is only if they need to, if the language training isn't available in the UK for them to start learning here, or if they need to learn, for example, a specific dialect and they can only learn that in the field, can they apply for a funding extension for the difficult language training extension? Because in this country, apparently learning a language is always difficult. And that will then give them a certain length of time to go and either kind of polish their language or to learn it from scratch if they need to.
I'll pick Lauren's question then. Would it be possible for my student to apply for IV for a visit in February 2025? And then you're mentioning a particular event. Uh, Now, I think if it's a very specific event, which, a conference or a seminar that takes place or some form of training, then the student doesn't actually have to go through the IV. They could use the research training support grant, the RTSG, and the RTSG is a bit more flexible. It's not a competition. It's something that we provide the student. So the student, with the application and with the support of the supervisor, will get that funding. So that's the way I would approach it. The overseas institutional visit, it's more about a host telling us that the student will be there with them. They will undertake several activities and things like that, and it's usually for a slightly more extended period of time than simply, a particular event.
I've been responding to Helga. Can I just check, Helga, have I answered your questions sufficiently? Yes, participant payments. So we have separate funds for overseas field work. We do not have a separate funding for UK-based field work, which I think is an error, because often UK-based field work is as expensive or sometimes more expensive than overseas field work. Those undertaking UK-based field work or paying participants must use their RTSG for that. I think I noted earlier that although we have a £3,000 limit for RTSG, where students are required to spend their RTSG on things that are essential to delivering their PhD projects, we will consider applications for funding that takes them over that £3,000 mark. And the reason for that is that students who don't have to spend their RTSG on things that are essential to delivering their PhD are advantaged in comparison with those students who do.
And that's the way kind of the grant works in a relatively flexible way. So just to give you a sense of the grant, so the grant basically is based on 29 core studentships, as we call them. Then the partners have committed themselves to match funding 25%, and through that we were able to award 41 studentships last year. So from the ESRC, we get the stipend and the fees, the home fees, by the way, not the international fees, although the partners have waived the international fees. And in addition to that, we get per student some additional funds, which are for RTSG and the Student Cohort Development Fund. Now, generally, those funds can be utilized flexibly. So we try to make as few commitments as possible in order to utilize those funds flexibly. So, for example, the RTHG pot is a pot that every student can tap into, but it's not ring-fenced the money to each student. So, we're not, and this is why we're saying sometimes students underutilize their RTSG, and therefore that gives us opportunity to spend more money on other students, which is necessary. And it is within our kind of remit to do that flexible kind of management. Most people will wonder how much the grant is. So just to give you a sense, in the next for the 5 years of the duration of the grant, the amount that we will be receiving from the SRC is over 15 million pounds. So it's quite a substantial amount of money, which covers obviously the stipends, the fees, as well as all these training opportunities. It is less generous than the previous grant, which poses a challenge for us in the sense that we got less money to spend on training, while at the same time the SRC is asking us to do more with that money. But I'm sure we will make it work for everyone.
Just one final thing that's occurred to me that I didn't mention earlier. Where you have a student who needs maternity leave and they are an international student, please be aware that their visa restrictions mean that they can only take 60 days maternity leave. If they take more than that, they will have to leave the country and they may have to reapply for a visa. This is a horribly discriminatory approach. We are challenging the ESRC on it, but they are bound by government regulations. So if a student comes to you who's pregnant and they're an international student, please make sure that they understand that. We're looking to see if we can change that, but no indication of that as yet. And what Mark was saying, all the SENSS policies and application forms are all on the VLE, and you will be able to access them there once you've been enrolled by SENSS.
Which, as I said, it should happen the next few days
Next
because we're doing a rolling kind of registration. So we're doing it in an automatic way. So you don't have to self-register. We take your information and we create a profile for you on the VLE. So you will be able to access that. Which means that you will be able to see also all the other training activities that we offer for our students. And some of you might have particular interest in SAGE Campus because it's a very good online resource even for supervisors. I've done some of the training myself there. This is the reflection pause, I assume. As I said, I appreciate there's a lot of information shared with you. We will be downloading and sharing the video and the slides with you. I don't know whether we can save the chat function as well.
Yeah, if it's recorded,
Yeah.
I'll get the chat function through.
So that means that the questions are there. Yes, the funding, Aldina, the funding for conference is part of the RTSG. So, and occasionally universities do top up that. So, sometimes institutions have an allowance for the PhD students, but then, and so these two things can be used at the same time. So someone can say, look, I'm applying for RTSG, but I also have secured £500 from my home institution for that conference. So it's absolutely fine if there are additional sources of funding. It could be for the OIV as well. It could be for any other activity. Right. I can see colleagues saying that they need to go to other meetings. I'm always happy to give people back some of their time. I know we scheduled it for 2 hours and we finished in 1 hour, 30 minutes. As I said, all the material will be available for you. I'd just like to congratulate you for getting a studentship. Sometimes we forget to celebrate. And these are quite competitive ones in the sense that, last year we had over 400 applications and we managed to award 41 of them. Especially of those of you that you are on the collaborative, we had quite a lot of applications last year as well. Very challenging to select the best projects. So I'd like to say we're here to support you, make use of us as a resource, and I'd like to wish you all the best for your supervision efforts. Thank you very much for attending.